Don't open that door. The words didn't come from anyone in the room, yet they echoed in Ethan Caldwell's mind the second his hand closed around the cold brass handle. The mansion was silent at this hour, the kind of heavy, expensive silence that swallowed sound and made every footstep feel like an intrusion. And yet there it was again. A faint, fragile noise behind the guest wing door, something soft, almost like a lullaby carried through the crack beneath it. Ethan paused, his jaw tightening, the dim hallway lights casting long shadows across the marble floor as the grandfather clock down the hall ticked with quiet precision, each second stretching longer than the last. No one was supposed to be in that room. Not staff, not guests, no one. He had made that clear. His house ran on order, on rules, on distance, especially distance. And yet the sound came again, barely audible, trembling, human. He pushed the door open. The hinges didn't creak, they never did. Everything in this house was engineered to be flawless, but the moment still felt like a break in something carefully controlled. Warm light spilled out into the hallway, soft and golden, completely out of place against the cold, polished stillness of the rest of the estate. And then he saw her. Lily Harper stood near the window, her back slightly turned, her uniform wrinkled like she had been moving too fast to care, her blonde hair loosely tied, strands falling around her face as she gently rocked back and forth. In her arms, cradled close to her chest, was a small child wrapped in a faded blue blanket, the kind you'd find in a hospital or a shelter, not in a house like this. The child's tiny hand clutched at her collar, and Lily's voice, soft and trembling, carried through the room as she hummed a lullaby, so quiet it felt like it might disappear if anyone breathed too hard. Ethan didn't move. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single image. The maid he barely noticed, standing in a room that wasn't hers, holding a child that definitely didn't belong there, singing like it was the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. "What are you doing?" His voice cut through the air sharper than he intended, low and controlled, but it shattered the fragile calm instantly. Lily froze. The humming stopped. Her shoulders stiffened before she slowly turned, eyes wide, fear flashing across her face before she could hide it. "Mr. Caldwell, I can't explain," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, instinctively pulling the child closer, as if shielding them from him. Ethan stepped inside, the door closing quietly behind him with a soft click that sounded final, sealing the moment in place. His gaze dropped to the child, then back to her, confusion mixing with something else he couldn't quite name. This wasn't part of his world. Nothing about this made sense. The house was supposed to be controlled, predictable, untouched by anything messy or emotional or real. And yet here she was, standing in the middle of it, holding something fragile, something human, something that didn't belong. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell felt something shift, subtle but undeniable, like a crack forming beneath ice he thought would never break. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything Ethan had experienced in years. Not the quiet of an empty house, but the kind that carried something unspoken, something alive beneath it. And for a brief moment he simply stood there, watching as Lily tightened her hold on the child, her fingers trembling slightly against the thin fabric of the blanket, while her eyes searched his face for something, permission or mercy, maybe both. And Ethan realized with a strange discomfort that no one had ever looked at him like that inside his own home, not his staff, not his business partners, not anyone, because no one ever needed anything from him beyond instructions and signatures. But this was different. This was raw and immediate and impossible to ignore, and it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "Explain," he said, his tone quieter now, but no less firm, and Lily swallowed, glancing down at the child whose breathing had begun to steady again, small and fragile, as if the entire world could tip with a single wrong move. "His name is Noah," she said softly, the words careful, measured, like she had practiced them in her head 100 times before this moment ever came. "He is my sister's son. She passed away 3 months ago, and there was no one else." Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly, the name hitting somewhere deeper than expected, but he pushed the reaction down, focusing instead on the facts, the rules, the order that had always defined his life. "And you thought bringing him here was acceptable?" he asked, stepping further into the room, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the hardwood floor as he stopped a few feet away from her. Lily shook her head quickly, panic flickering across her expression. "No, sir, I know it is not allowed. I only bring him at night, when everyone is asleep. I could not leave him alone, and I cannot afford full-time care yet. I am trying, I promise I am trying." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, but she did not look away, and that alone caught him off guard, because most people in her position would have lowered their eyes, would have apologized endlessly, would have made themselves smaller to survive the moment, but she stood there, exhausted and afraid, yet still holding her ground in the only way she could. Ethan's eyes drifted to the child again, to the tiny hand gripping her uniform, to the faint rise and fall of his chest, and something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Not pity, not exactly, but something close enough to make him uncomfortable. "You understand that this is a violation of your employment terms," he said, the words automatic, almost rehearsed, the language of contracts and boundaries slipping into place like armor, and for a second he expected her to break, to plead, to crumble under the weight of it, but instead she nodded slowly, her grip on Noah tightening just a fraction. "Yes, sir, I do. If you need to let me go, I understand. I just needed a little more time." The honesty in her voice lingered in the room long after she finished speaking, and Ethan found himself unable to respond immediately, his mind moving through logic, through policy, through every reason this situation should have been simple to resolve, and yet none of those reasons seemed to fit the image in front of him. None of them accounted for the quiet strength in her voice or the way the child had calmed the moment she held him. And as the clock down the hall marked another passing second, Ethan Caldwell stood in his own house, in a room that was never meant to be used, realizing that for the first time in years, something inside his carefully controlled world did not follow the rules, and he was not entirely sure he wanted it to. The hallway felt colder when Ethan stepped out of the room, the door closing behind him with that same quiet precision. But this time the silence did not settle the way it usually did. It pressed against him, followed him, lingered in a way that made it impossible to ignore what he had just seen. And as he walked past the tall windows overlooking the dark grounds of his estate, his reflection stared back at him. Sharp suit, perfect posture, controlled expression, a man who had built his life on order and distance. And yet his thoughts kept drifting back to the small room at the end of the hall, to the way Lily had held that child like nothing else mattered, like the world could fall apart, and she would still stand there, holding on. He stopped near the staircase, one hand resting lightly on the polished railing, and for a moment he simply stood there, listening, half expecting to hear that soft lullaby again through the walls. But there was nothing now, only the steady ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the house systems running in perfect synchronization, everything exactly as it should be, except it did not feel that way anymore. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to return to the familiar rhythm of logic, of decisions made without hesitation, because that was who he was, a man who solved problems, who removed variables, who enforced rules, and this situation had a clear solution. It always did. But instead of moving toward it, his mind replayed her words, "I just needed a little more time." And there was something about the way she said it that refused to be dismissed, something that did not sound like an excuse or manipulation, but like truth, simple and unguarded. Upstairs, in a room she was not supposed to use, Lily sat on the edge of the bed, her back against the wall as she gently adjusted the blanket around Noah, her hands still slightly shaking from the encounter, her heart refusing to slow down as she listened for footsteps, for the sound of a decision being made without her. Because she knew how this worked, she had seen it before, rules were rules. And people like her did not get exceptions, but even as fear settled in her chest, she leaned down and brushed her fingers lightly over Noah's hair, her voice returning in a whisper, softer than before, almost afraid to exist. "It is okay. I am right here." And the child shifted slightly, breathing evening out again, trusting her without question. Downstairs, Ethan turned away from the staircase and walked toward his office, but he did not sit, did not open his laptop, did not reach for the stack of documents waiting for his approval. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out into the darkness, his reflection faint against the glass, and for the first time in years, his thoughts were not on numbers or contracts or expansion plans. They were on a quiet room, a frightened woman, and a child who had no place in his world, and yet somehow, had already changed it. He closed his eyes briefly, a rare break in his composure, and when he opened them again, the decision still had not come, but something else had, a question he could not ignore, not about policy or rules, but about himself, about the kind of man he had become, and whether the life he had built left any room at all for something as simple and as inconvenient as compassion. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of pale, slow light that crept through the tall windows and softened the edges of the mansion without ever truly warming it. And yet something felt different as the house began its routine, subtle but unmistakable, like a shift in the air that no one could name. And in the kitchen, Lily moved carefully, more quietly than usual, her eyes flicking toward the hallway every few seconds as if expecting someone to appear, her hands steady out of habit, but her thoughts scattered, replaying the night over and over. Every word, every look, every second Ethan Caldwell had stood in that doorway, because she knew what should have happened by now. She should have been called in, dismissed, replaced. That was how these things worked. But the silence had stretched into morning, and that uncertainty felt heavier than any immediate consequence. Upstairs, in the guest room, Noah was still asleep, his small form curled under the thin blanket, his breathing soft and even, and before leaving, Lily had pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, whispering promises she was not sure she could keep, promises of safety, of staying together, of somehow finding a way through a world that had not made room for either of them. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts, measured and familiar, and her body tensed instinctively before she even turned, because she knew that pace, controlled, unhurried, the kind of presence that filled a space without needing to announce itself. And when she looked up, Ethan was already standing at the edge of the kitchen, his expression unreadable, his posture as composed as ever, as if nothing had changed at all. "Coffee is ready, sir," she said quickly, her voice respectful, steady, exactly as it should be, as if the night before had never happened, as if she could return everything to its proper place by simply acting the part well enough. Ethan did not respond immediately. His gaze moved past her, briefly scanning the kitchen, the spotless counters, the organized shelves, the quiet efficiency of a space that reflected her work, and then it returned to her, not harsh, not cold, but searching in a way that made her chest tighten. "Did the child sleep well?" he asked finally, his tone neutral, almost casual, but the question itself landed with unexpected weight. Lily blinked, caught off guard, her fingers tightening slightly around the dish towel in her hands. "Yes, sir," she answered softly, hesitating just a fraction before adding, "Thank you." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and for a second she looked down, unsure if she had crossed a line simply by acknowledging something that had not been spoken. Ethan's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, a small change that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Lily saw it, because she was looking for it, searching for any sign of what would come next. "You will not bring him into the main areas of the house," he said, his voice returning to that familiar tone of control, of structure, the language of rules reasserting itself, and Lily nodded quickly, relief and confusion mixing together in equal measure. "Of course, sir. I understand." There was a pause, brief but significant, and then he added, "Make sure he has what he needs." The sentence was simple, almost dismissive, but it lingered in the air long after he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Lily standing there, her heart racing in a way she did not fully understand, because this was not forgiveness, not approval, not anything clearly defined, and yet it was not rejection either. And as she slowly exhaled, her grip loosening on the towel, she realized that something had changed, not just for her, but for him, even if neither of them knew what it meant yet. The rest of the morning unfolded with a strange, fragile normalcy, the kind that looked unchanged on the surface but carried something unspoken underneath, and Lily moved through her tasks with quiet precision, polishing glass, adjusting linens, preparing rooms that would likely never be used, yet her attention kept drifting upstairs, to the guest room where Noah lay sleeping, and every few minutes she found an excuse to pass by the hallway, to listen for any sound, any sign that he was awake. Because even with Ethan's words echoing in her mind, "Make sure he has what he needs," she could not fully believe that this fragile arrangement would hold. Upstairs, Noah stirred just before noon, his small voice calling out softly, confused and still caught between sleep and unfamiliar surroundings. And Lily was there within seconds, kneeling beside the bed, her hand brushing gently against his cheek as she whispered reassurance, her voice low and steady. "It is okay, sweetheart. I am right here." And the child blinked up at her, eyes still heavy, trusting her completely in a way that made her chest ache with both love and fear, because trust, like that, came with a weight she could not afford to drop. Downstairs, Ethan sat in his office, a stack of reports open in front of him, numbers and projections laid out with perfect clarity, the kind of information he usually processed without effort. But today the lines blurred, the figures losing their sharp edges as his focus drifted, his mind returning again and again to a small boy in a blue blanket and a woman who had stood her ground without defiance, without anger, just quiet determination, and it unsettled him more than any negotiation ever had. He leaned back slightly in his chair, tapping a pen against the desk in a slow, rhythmic pattern, a habit he had developed years ago, back when decisions had felt heavier, more personal, before he had learned how to separate himself from the outcomes. And for a moment, that distance felt thinner, like something was slipping through the cracks he had built so carefully. A soft knock at the door pulled him back, and his assistant stepped in, tablet in hand, her tone professional as she reviewed his afternoon schedule, meetings, calls, obligations lined up with precision, and Ethan nodded at the appropriate moments, his responses automatic, until she paused, hesitating just slightly before adding, "There is also a note from housekeeping. They wanted to confirm if there have been any changes to staff protocols." Ethan's gaze lifted, sharp again, focused, and for a second the room seemed to hold its breath. "No changes," he said evenly, his voice leaving no room for interpretation, and yet something in his expression suggested the answer was not as simple as it sounded. The assistant nodded and left, the door closing softly behind her, and Ethan remained still for a moment longer before standing, moving toward the window once more, his reflection staring back at him, composed, controlled, unchanged, except he knew that was not entirely true anymore. Upstairs, Lily sat cross-legged on the floor beside the bed, a small plastic container of food open between her and Noah, carefully feeding him bite by bite, her movements patient, gentle, turning something simple into something safe, something steady, and the room, though temporary, felt warmer than the rest of the house combined, filled with quiet sounds, soft voices, the kind of life that did not belong in a place built on perfection. As Noah smiled faintly, reaching for her hand with a small, trusting grip, Lily's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the fear faded, replaced by something stronger, something that had carried her this far and would carry her further if it had to. And she did not notice the figure standing just outside the slightly open door, watching in silence, seeing more than he had expected, and feeling more than he was ready to admit. He should have walked away, but Ethan did not, and that alone unsettled him more than anything he had seen so far, because standing just outside the slightly open door, watching a moment that was never meant for him, he realized he was no longer observing as the owner of the house, but as something else entirely, something quieter, something that did not fit into the structured world he had spent years building. And inside the room, Lily laughed softly as Noah tried to grab the spoon from her hand, his small fingers clumsy but determined, the faintest smile spreading across his face as if the world had not already asked too much of him. And the sound of that laughter, light and unguarded, landed somewhere deep in Ethan's chest, unfamiliar and disarming in a way he could not immediately process. "Hey, slow down," Lily murmured gently, adjusting her grip as she guided the spoon back, her voice carrying a warmth that did not exist anywhere else in the house, a warmth that had nothing to do with wealth or comfort, but something far more basic, far more human. And as she brushed a small piece of food from Noah's cheek, her expression softened in a way that spoke of exhaustion and love at the same time, a balance that only came from carrying more than one person's weight for too long. Ethan's hand rested lightly against the doorframe, his posture still, controlled, but his thoughts anything but, because this was not what he expected to find, not manipulation, not carelessness, not even defiance, but something simple and undeniable, care given without expectation. and it forced him to confront something he had spent years avoiding. The difference between providing and being present, between building a life and actually living one. A small cough from Noah broke the moment, sudden and sharp, and Lily's entire focus shifted instantly, her body leaning forward, her hand moving to his back in a gentle, practiced rhythm, her voice lowering as she whispered reassurance. "It is okay. Just breathe. I have you." And the way she said it, calm despite the flicker of worry in her eyes, revealed something else, something deeper. This was not new for her. This was routine, something she had learned to manage on her own, without help, without support, and that realization settled heavily in Ethan's chest. He pushed the door open slightly wider before he could stop himself, the movement small but enough to draw her attention, and Lily's head turned quickly, surprise flashing across her face before she straightened, instinctively shifting Noah closer, as if to shield him again. "I am sorry, sir. I did not realize you were there," she said, her voice steady but softer now, cautious, and Ethan stepped just inside the doorway, his gaze moving from her to the child, then back again, the silence stretching for a brief moment before he spoke. "Does he see a doctor?" The question came out more direct than intended, cutting through the space without pretense, and Lily hesitated, just for a second, before answering honestly. "Not as often as he should," she admitted quietly, her eyes dropping briefly before lifting again, meeting his without challenge, just truth. "I am saving for it." The simplicity of the answer lingered, and Ethan felt something shift again, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that did not come from logic or obligation, but from recognition, and for the first time, the situation in front of him did not feel like a problem to solve, but a reality he could not ignore. And as Noah reached out again, his small hand brushing against Lily's sleeve, Ethan found himself standing there longer than necessary, caught between the man he had always been and the one he was slowly, unwillingly, beginning to become. The question lingered in the room long after it was asked, simple on the surface but heavy with everything it implied, and Lily felt it settle in her chest as she adjusted Noah slightly, her fingers brushing gently along his back as if grounding herself before answering anything more, because this was the line she had been trying to hold, the fragile space between surviving quietly and being seen too clearly, and once crossed, there was no going back to being invisible. "I take him to a clinic about 3 miles from here," she said carefully, her voice steady but softer now, as if each word needed to be placed with intention. "They see him when they can. It is not always consistent." Ethan's gaze did not leave her, not sharp, not accusing, but focused in a way that made it clear he was listening, really listening, not just hearing information to act on, and that alone shifted something in the room. "What is wrong with him?" he asked, and this time there was no edge to the question, only quiet directness. Lily hesitated, not out of reluctance, but out of habit, the instinct to protect, to not say too much, to not risk losing what little stability she had managed to build. But Noah shifted slightly in her arms, his small hand tightening around her sleeve, and that simple movement was enough to push her past hesitation. "He was born early," she explained, her eyes softening as she looked down at him. "His lungs are weak. Some days are better than others, but when it gets bad, he struggles to breathe." The words were calm, almost practiced, but the weight behind them was unmistakable, and Ethan felt it land in a place he had kept closed for a long time, a place tied to memories he did not allow himself to revisit, memories of a hospital room, of quiet machines, of something fragile slipping away before he had fully understood how to hold on to it. He looked away for a moment, just a fraction of a second, but enough to steady himself, and when his gaze returned, it carried something different, something less guarded. "How long have you been managing this on your own?" he asked, and Lily gave a small, almost apologetic smile, the kind that did not quite reach her eyes. "Since my sister passed," she said simply, as if that answered everything, and in a way, it did. The room fell quiet again, but it was not the same silence as before. It was fuller, heavier with understanding, with truths that had been spoken aloud and could no longer be ignored. Noah shifted again, his eyes fluttering open briefly before settling back, and Lily adjusted the blanket around him with practiced care, her movements gentle, instinctive, and Ethan watched, really watched this time, not as an observer of something out of place, but as someone beginning to understand the depth of what stood in front of him. "Does he have medication?" he asked after a moment, his voice lower now, less formal, and Lily nodded slightly. "Sometimes," she admitted, "when I can afford it." There was no shame in her tone, no attempt to soften the truth, just quiet honesty, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because he was used to people bending the truth around him, adjusting it to fit what they thought he wanted to hear. But she did not. She simply told it as it was, and in doing so, she made it impossible for him to look away. Ethan took a slow breath, his mind moving through options, through solutions, through the instinct to fix, to intervene. But something held him back, not uncertainty, but awareness, the realization that whatever he chose to do next would not just solve a problem. It would change something fundamental in the fragile balance that had formed between them, and for the first time in a long time, he did not rush the decision. He simply stood there, in a room that no longer felt out of place, watching a woman who had every reason to break, and yet had not, and a child who depended on her in ways that made everything else seem smaller, and he realized, quietly and without warning, that this was no longer just about rules or boundaries. It was about something far more complicated, something that did not fit neatly into the life he had built, but was beginning to matter anyway. The room seemed to hold its breath as Ethan remained where he stood, not stepping closer, not stepping away, caught in a space that no longer felt like his own, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet filled only by the soft, uneven rhythm of Noah's breathing and the faint rustle of fabric as Lily adjusted the blanket again, her movements careful, instinctive, as if she had learned to measure every motion against the child's fragile limits. Ethan's gaze lingered on the small rise and fall of Noah's chest, on the way each breath seemed just slightly harder than it should be, and something tightened in his chest, subtle but persistent, a feeling he recognized but had spent years refusing to name. "How often does it get worse?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, less formal, as if the room itself had reshaped the way he spoke. Lily hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way she could not soften. "A few times a week," she admitted quietly, her eyes still on Noah, "sometimes more if the weather changes, or if he gets tired." She paused for a brief moment, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge of the blanket before adding, "At night is usually the hardest." The words settled between them, and Ethan felt them land deeper than expected, because night was when everything else in his world slowed down, when control returned, when silence meant peace. But for her, for this child, night meant uncertainty, meant watching every breath, waiting for something to go wrong. He shifted his weight slightly, his hand brushing against the edge of the dresser as if grounding himself in something solid, something familiar, but the room did not feel like part of his world anymore, not in the way it used to. "And you manage it alone," he said, not quite a question, more an observation, and Lily gave a small nod, her expression calm but tired in a way that spoke of long nights and quiet resilience. "I do what I can," she said simply, and there was no self-pity in her voice, no attempt to make it sound harder or easier than it was, just truth. Ethan let out a slow breath, his mind moving through options again, through systems and solutions, but this time the process felt different, less like a calculation and more like a decision that would carry weight beyond numbers or outcomes. And for the first time, he did not immediately look for the most efficient answer. Instead, he stepped a little further into the room, closing the distance just enough to feel present without intruding, his gaze steady as he spoke again. "There is a pediatric specialist at Caldwell Medical," he said, his tone measured, controlled, but beneath it there was something else, something quieter. "They handle cases like this." Lily looked up at him then, surprise flickering across her face before she could hide it, her grip on Noah tightening slightly, as if the words themselves had shifted the ground beneath her. "I could not afford that, sir," she said softly, the statement not defensive, not dismissive, just factual, the kind of truth she had learned to accept without question. Ethan held her gaze, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes had softened, just enough to be seen if someone was looking closely. "That is not what I said," he replied, his voice steady, leaving the rest of the sentence unspoken but understood, and the room fell quiet again, not with tension this time, but with something else, something fragile and unfamiliar, like the beginning of a change neither of them had planned for, but neither of them could ignore anymore. For a moment, Lily did not move, did not speak, as if the air itself had shifted too suddenly for her to catch up, and Ethan could see it in the way her eyes searched his face, not for permission this time, but for clarity, because what he had just offered did not belong in her world, not in the way he said it, simple and direct, as if it were just another decision, just another resource to allocate. But for her, it was something far more complicated, something that came with questions she had learned to ask before accepting anything. Sir, she began carefully, her voice soft but steady. I do not want to cause trouble for you or for the house. The words were measured, chosen with care, but beneath them was something deeper, a quiet boundary she had built over time. The understanding that help often came with conditions, expectations, things that could not always be seen at first. Ethan held her gaze, his expression unchanged, but there was a stillness to him now, a kind of patience that had not been there before. This is not about the house, he said, his tone even, almost quiet, and the simplicity of the statement made it harder to dismiss. Lily hesitated again, her fingers brushing lightly over Noah's back as if grounding herself in something she understood, something real and immediate, and Noah shifted slightly, a faint cough breaking through the moment, small but enough to tighten her chest instantly, her focus snapping back to him, her hand moving in that same gentle rhythm, steady, practiced, reassuring. Ethan watched the motion, the instinct behind it, and something in him settled, not completely, but enough to move forward. He needs consistent care, he said, not as a command, not as a correction, but as a fact, and Lily nodded slowly, her eyes still on Noah. I know, she whispered, the weight of those two words carrying more than any explanation could. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was not uncertain, it was reflective, as if both of them were standing at the edge of something neither had planned for, and Ethan took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to be present without overwhelming the space. There will be no report, no change to your position, he continued, his voice steady, deliberate, each word placed with intention. You will take him to Caldwell Medical tomorrow morning. I will have everything arranged. Lily looked up at him again, and this time the surprise did not fade as quickly. It lingered, mixed with something else, something more cautious, more fragile, because offers like that did not come without weight, and she had learned to recognize that. Why? She asked quietly, the question simple but honest, not challenging, not ungrateful, just needing to understand. Ethan paused, just for a second, the answer not as immediate as the decision had been, because the truth was not something he was used to saying out loud, not in situations like this, not in a room that felt more real than anything he had stepped into in years. His gaze shifted briefly to Noah, to the small rise and fall of his chest, to the way Lily's hand remained steady against his back, and when he looked at her again, there was something different in his eyes, something less guarded, more human. Because he should not have to struggle to breathe, he said finally, his voice low, the words simple but carrying a weight that lingered long after they were spoken, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them filled with something quiet and undeniable, something that did not belong to rules or contracts, but to something else entirely, something that was beginning to take shape whether they were ready for it or not. The room remained still for a long moment after his words settled, as if even the air needed time to adjust to what had just been said, and Lily felt it in the way her breath slowed, in the way her fingers gently tightened against Noah's small back, grounding herself in something real while everything else seemed to shift around her, because this was not something she had planned for, not something she had prepared herself to accept, and yet it was there, undeniable and immediate. She lowered her gaze briefly, her thoughts moving quickly, weighing the offer not against pride, but against reality, against the quiet nights spent counting breaths, against the moments when Noah's small body tensed, and she had no choice but to wait and hope it would pass. And when she looked up again, there was something different in her expression, still cautious, still careful, but no longer resisting. Thank you, she said softly, the words simple but sincere, carrying more weight than they might have sounded, because gratitude for her was never casual. It was something earned, something given with full awareness of what it meant. Ethan gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging the moment without wanting to draw attention to it. And for a brief second, the space between them felt balanced, not defined by status or rules, but by something quieter, something shared in that room. Noah shifted again, a faint sound escaping him, and Lily instinctively leaned closer, her hand moving in that same gentle rhythm, her voice returning to a soft whisper, steady and calm. "It is okay. I am here." And Ethan watched, his gaze lingering not just on the action, but on the certainty behind it. The way she did not hesitate, did not question, simply responded. And he realized that this was not something she had learned from instruction or obligation. This was who she was. "There will be a driver ready at 8 in the morning," he said after a moment, his voice returning to its usual composure, but softer at the edges. "You will go directly to the hospital. They are expecting you." Lily nodded again, absorbing the details, already shifting into the practical, the part of her that knew how to move forward when given a path, even if it felt unfamiliar. "I will be ready," she replied quietly, and for a second, her eyes met his again, and there was something unspoken there, something that neither of them named, but both understood, a fragile trust beginning to form in a space that had not been meant for it. Ethan turned then, stepping back toward the door, his movements controlled as always, but slower than before, as if leaving required more effort than entering had. And just before he reached the threshold, he paused, his hand resting lightly against the frame, and without looking back, he added, "Make sure he rests tonight." The words were simple, almost routine, but they carried a weight that lingered, a quiet acknowledgement that this mattered, that the child, the woman, the situation, all of it had moved beyond being something temporary or inconvenient. Lily watched him for a moment as he left, the door closing softly behind him, and the room seemed to exhale, the tension easing just slightly, replaced by something fragile but steady, and she looked down at Noah, her hand brushing gently over his hair, her voice softer now, filled with something new, something she had not allowed herself to feel before. "We are going to be okay," she whispered, and for the first time in a long while, the words did not feel like something she was forcing herself to believe, but something that might actually be true. The night passed slower than usual, stretching each hour into something heavier, more deliberate. And for Lily, sleep came in fragments, never fully settling, her awareness tied to the quiet rhythm of Noah's breathing beside her, every small shift, every soft sound pulling her back to the present, reminding her of what mattered. And yet beneath that constant vigilance, something else lingered, something unfamiliar, a fragile sense of possibility she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. By the time the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, pale and steady, she was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, watching Noah as he slept, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt more stable than the night before. And for a moment, she simply let herself breathe, slow and quiet, as if holding on to that stillness before the day began. Downstairs, the house had already shifted into motion, subtle but precise, the kind of efficiency that came from years of routine. And when Lily stepped into the hallway, carefully carrying Noah wrapped securely in the same faded blue blanket, she felt it immediately, the difference, the quiet awareness that something had changed, not visibly, not in the structure of the house or the behavior of the staff, but in the way the space seemed to hold her now, less distant, less indifferent. At exactly 8 o'clock, the car was waiting, sleek and polished at the front entrance, the driver standing beside it with professional composure, and Lily hesitated for just a second before stepping forward, adjusting her hold on Noah as she approached, her movements careful but steady, because this was real now, no longer just words spoken in a quiet room, but something that had taken form, something she could not step back from. "Good morning, ma'am," the driver said respectfully, opening the door, and Lily nodded, her voice soft as she responded, "Good morning," before carefully settling into the back seat, keeping Noah close, her hand instinctively resting against his back, feeling each breath as if anchoring herself to it. As the car pulled away from the estate, the world outside shifted, the wide, quiet grounds giving way to the movement of the city, and Lily watched it pass through the window, her thoughts moving between the present and what lay ahead, uncertainty still there, but no longer overwhelming, because for the first time, she was not facing it alone. At the hospital, everything moved quickly, efficiently, the staff already prepared, already expecting her, and that alone made her pause, just for a moment, the realization settling in that someone had arranged this, had thought it through, had made sure there would be no hesitation, no delay, and as she followed the nurse down the hallway, Noah resting quietly against her shoulder, she felt something shift again, deeper this time, something that felt like relief but carried more weight than she was used to holding. In another part of the city, Ethan stood in his office, looking out over the skyline, the glass reflecting the same composed figure he had always seen, but his thoughts were not on the city, not on the meetings scheduled for the day or the decisions waiting to be made. They were on a small boy in a hospital hallway and a woman who had trusted him enough to step into something uncertain, and as he stood there, hands resting lightly against the edge of his desk, he realized that this was no longer just an action, no longer just a solution to a problem. It was a choice, one that had already begun to change something in him, something he had not planned for and could no longer ignore. The hospital room felt different from the moment Lily stepped inside, not cold in the way she expected, but calm, almost quiet in a way that made it easier to breathe. And as the nurse gently guided her to the bed, helping her settle Noah onto the soft white sheets, Lily stayed close, her hand never leaving him, her fingers resting lightly against his small arm as if reminding both of them that they were still together in this unfamiliar place. Machines hummed softly in the background, steady and controlled, a contrast to the uncertainty she had grown used to. And for the first time in months, she was not the one measuring every breath, not the only one watching, and that alone made her chest loosen just slightly. "We are going to run a few tests," the doctor explained kindly, his tone professional but warm. "We want to understand exactly how his lungs are functioning so we can create a proper treatment plan." Lily nodded, absorbing every word, her attention sharp, focused, because this was what she had been trying to reach for all along, not just temporary relief, but something stable, something that could give Noah a chance to grow without constant fear. As the medical team began their work, gentle and careful, Lily stepped back just enough to give them space, but her eyes never left him, following every movement, every adjustment, until one of the nurses offered her a quiet smile. "You can sit," she said softly, gesturing to the chair beside the bed. "We will take good care of him." Lily hesitated for a moment, the habit of staying on her feet, of always being ready, still holding her in place, but slowly, she allowed herself to sit, her hands resting in her lap, her shoulders lowering just slightly as the weight she had carried for so long eased, if only a little. Across the city, Ethan stood just outside the hospital room, his presence unnoticed, his posture still composed, but his gaze fixed through the glass window as he watched the scene unfold, the quiet efficiency of the staff, the careful attention given to a child who had gone too long without it, and at the center of it, Lily, sitting beside the bed, her focus unwavering, her expression softer now, touched with something that looked like hope. He had not planned to come, not officially, not in a way that would draw attention, but something had pulled him there anyway, something that refused to stay behind in the structured world he understood, and as he stood there, he realized that this was no longer about obligation or responsibility. It was about presence, about choosing to be part of something he could have easily kept at a distance. Inside the room, Noah shifted slightly, his eyes opening just enough to find Lily, and when he saw her, his small fingers moved, reaching, and she was there instantly, leaning forward, her hand closing gently around his, her voice soft and steady. "I am right here," and the child relaxed, his breathing evening out under the quiet care surrounding him. Ethan watched that moment, the simplicity of it, the trust, the connection, and something in his chest tightened again, not with discomfort this time, but with something deeper, something that felt like recognition. And as he stood there, separated by a thin pane of glass that suddenly felt like more than just a barrier, he understood something he had not allowed himself to see before, that healing was not just about fixing what was broken, it was about being present when it mattered, about choosing to stay, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell did not turn away. Days passed with a quiet steadiness that felt unfamiliar but welcome, and for the first time in a long while, Lily found herself waking without that immediate weight pressing against her chest, Because each morning now began not with uncertainty, but with a plan, with scheduled checkups, with medication carefully measured and explained, and with doctors who did not turn her away or ask her to wait until it was too late. And as Noah's breathing grew stronger, more consistent, the fragile tension that had once defined every moment began to ease, replaced by something softer, something that felt like the beginning of relief. The hospital staff moved with quiet confidence around them, adjusting treatments, offering reassurance, and Lily listened to every word, absorbing it, learning, her questions thoughtful and steady, because this was no longer just about getting through each day. It was about building something that could last, something that could hold. Ethan returned more than once, never announced, never making his presence known to anyone but her, standing just inside the doorway or just outside the glass, watching, not as a distant observer anymore, but as someone who had chosen to be there. And each time, Lily noticed, even when he did not step forward, even when he said nothing, because his presence had shifted from something intimidating to something grounding, something she could feel without needing to look. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, soft and warm against the pale walls, Noah sat up for the first time without struggle, his small hand steady as he reached for a toy placed beside him. And Lily laughed, a sound light and genuine, her eyes filling with something she had held back for too long. And in that moment, everything felt different, not perfect, but possible. "You see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she looked toward the doorway where Ethan stood, his posture still, composed, but his expression no longer unreadable. He has not done that before. Ethan stepped inside then, slowly, as if careful not to disturb the moment, his gaze fixed on the child, on the simple, powerful proof that something had changed, and for a second, he said nothing, because words did not seem enough, not for this, not for what he was witnessing. "He will do more," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain, and Lily nodded, her smile softening as she looked back at Noah, her hand resting gently over his. The room felt warmer then, filled with a quiet sense of progress, of something healing not just in the child, but in the space around them, in the connection that had formed without intention but had grown anyway. As the afternoon stretched on, Ethan remained longer than usual, not out of obligation, not because there was something to manage or oversee, but because leaving felt less natural than staying. And as he stood there, watching Lily guide Noah's small hands, hearing the soft rhythm of her voice as she encouraged him, he understood something with a clarity that surprised him, that this had changed him in a way he had not expected, not through force or demand, but through something far simpler, something he had overlooked for too long. When Lily finally looked up at him again, there was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty in her expression, only quiet trust, and as their eyes met, the space between them no longer felt divided by roles or distance, but connected by something real, something that had been built moment by moment, choice by choice, and without needing to say it. Both of them understood that this was not the end of something difficult, but the beginning of something meaningful, something that neither of them had planned, but both of them were now ready to protect.